Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening for our third listening conversation. Today's session is about the history of Juneteenth. So this is an opportunity for those of you out there that are listening to hear what people of color, some of the issues that people of color have had to and continue to face here in America, and especially in our towns around us, Somers, Suffield, Stafford, Ellington, and so forth. So the idea is that by you listening, hopefully you might help us to resolve the myriad of issues that continue to plague people of color here in America. So my name is Giselle Genesi, and I'm the chair of the Somers Advocates for Social Justice, SASJ, Somers for Black Lives. So this event, again, is a collaborative effort between SASJ, that's Somers Advocates for Social Justice, ABAR Suffield, Ellington Equality, and the Stafford Springs Diversity Coalition. I'd like to begin by welcoming Dr. Christopher Tinson and Ms. Karen Prescott. And if I might just take a moment to read their bios. So Dr. Tinson is an associate professor of Africana Studies and History at St. Louis University. His first book, Radical Intellect, Liberator Magazine and Black Activism in the 1960s, was the winner of the inaugural Pauli Murray Prize for the best book in African American intellectual history from the African American Intellectual History Society. Tinson is a highly sought after speaker, mentor, and award-winning author whose material has been shared in major publications. Welcome, Dr. Tinson. Ms. Karen Prescott is the mother of 3 beautiful Black children, Jaden, Johnny, and Jordan. She is a social activist, an advocate, organizer, entrepreneur, and author with a degree in psychology from LaSalle University. Ms. Prescott is unabashedly outspoken, discerningly smart, and a powerful, impassioned public speaker. She is known as white supremacy's worst nightmare. And so I'd like to begin by welcoming members of our audience as well. And I would like to ask that you post any questions you may have in the chat. Our speakers will address them throughout this session. And now to Juneteenth. So as you all know, or may or may not know, June 19th, 2021 marked the 156th anniversary of Juneteenth, which commemorated the day slavery ended in 1965. My first question is to Dr. Tinson. Dr. Tinson, as you know, many people here in Connecticut and in northern states believe slavery did not exist in our neck of the woods. Can you give a brief history of slavery as it existed both in the northern and in the southern states?
Sure. Well, first, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Giselle, for the invitation. Yeah, we don't have to spend an inordinate amount of time on it because it's really a long history. The slavery in this country goes back to the founding of the country, and even before the founding of the country. And I think the founding of the country with the 13 colonies was already entangled in the global enterprise of slavery. It accelerated at certain points, but it was certainly there from the very beginning. And so when we think about the Northeast, the way in which the Northeast escapes our understanding of contemporary discussions of slavery is because by the 1830s, essentially the North had developed to an extent to where they didn't have to rely on the full-fledged plantation economy, and they could basically move on to more industrial forms. And so they were able to kind of relegate the institution of slavery to the South, and it became, in everybody's mind, a Southern enterprise from that point on. But up until that point, the North was just as complicit. Many of its ports were just as fertile, if you will, with the slavery enterprise, busy waterways facing the Atlantic, all the way from Virginia, all the way up the Eastern Seaboard. So there was no place in the United States at that time, what became the United States, that was untouched by slavery and by the enterprise of slavery. And so transatlantic slavery is a global enterprise, touched every facet of the economy. And it's only in modern history that we start to decouple the North from slavery, and what precipitated and led to the Civil War and trying to protect the Union, right? And so, one of the things I think about when we talk about Juneteenth is, these moments of celebration are important. And I do think we should at least just mark the fact that it is a historic gesture to have this holiday. But without a full accounting of our history and how entangled it was in essentially, corralling and containing and contaminating many facets of Black possibility, African possibility, relegating Black people to second class, third class, zero class citizenship, is something that this invites us. This holiday should invite us to that deep dive into our history and the entanglement of it, the murkiness of it, the ugliness of it. And I think that to the extent that this holiday allows us to do that work and commits us to that, then I think we should commemorate, and continue to honor this holiday as much as we can. Now, the last thing I'll say right quick as we start is just, yes, I think this is about Black freedom in particular. And I think that we need to honor that as an understanding. That should be part of our understanding that this is about Black freedom in this country. But by no means was slavery only practiced in the United States. In many places in the Caribbean, in Central America, and indeed in South America, there are commemorations of Juneteenth for the abolition of slavery in the United States, but also the abolition of slavery throughout the Western Hemisphere. So I want to just underscore the great importance of Black freedom to the Western Hemisphere.
Absolutely. And of course, for those who say that, history, the United States was owned, I am glad that you highlighted that, because that's for those who say that the United States was not the only country that engaged in slavery. It is basically the level to which slavery occurred in this country, and it's about what continues to happen even today because of slavery. But before we dive deeper into Juneteenth, I just want to go to Ms. Prescott, because I know that she lives this. Dr. Tinson, this is your life. You teach African studies and so forth. But Ms. Prescott, I just want you to tell us a little bit about how you came to be involved in this work. How did it all start for you? What led you to this point, brought you to this point?
I like to remind people that I didn't just get started a year ago after the murder of George Floyd. That is when I really showed up in towns that look like Manchester, Somers, Newington, Stafford. But I really was led to doing the work for all marginalized and oppressed people, I think in part due to what's in my DNA. Both of my parents are pastors. And so we've always been, we were raised with the notion that our lives are here to serve others. We should be of service to other people. We should be able to help those that we can help. We should be able to advocate for those that we can advocate. And so that journey really began, I would say, probably in Philadelphia, working in some of the most horrific homeless shelters and some of the worst parts of Philadelphia, where the majority of the people in those shelters were Black people and brown people, but mostly Black people. But after the murder of George Floyd, the things that I was doing here in Manchester, it was time for me to peel back the covers. I was underneath the covers fighting for my children and other children, and having meetings by myself with a room full of white administrators trying to open their eyes to what was happening in the school systems right here. And after the murder of George Floyd, it was important for me to stop having those secret meetings because they were able to gaslight me and they were able to kind of brush me off. And so I decided, you know what, no more of these little backdoor meetings where you try to address what's happening with my child. I'm now going to address what's happening to all the Black and brown children in this town. So that's really where I started to take a much more unapologetic and vocal stand, and primarily because I was quiet because I was afraid of ostracizing my children. Up until I want to say last year, maybe 8th grade, 9th grade, both of my daughters were usually the only Black kid while we were living here in Connecticut in their friend circle. And so I didn't want to be too vocal because I didn't want to isolate them. But I could no longer take it. And so I just had to do what I knew what I had to do. And I knew I had to do what I was called to do. And so that's when I began to, take it to the streets and not only take it to the streets, take it to the Capitol, lobbying the, town center, and eventually, building this organization, Power Up.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Prescott. I'd like to follow that with Juneteenth, because at the end of this, by the end of this discussion, we want people to have a good understanding of what Juneteenth is and what they can do moving forward. So let's go back to education. When did you first learn about Juneteenth in school, if ever? And if you might also reflect on your childhood education versus your children's education today. Do you think that anything has changed as far as the teaching of history and our schools are concerned? So let's talk first about when you first heard about Juneteenth, because this is new for many people, especially those in our listening world right now. When did you first learn of Juneteenth?
I was an adult. I didn't learn anything about Juneteenth in high school, middle school, elementary school. So I was an adult when I started to hear about it. And I was even more of an adult when I really started to walk away from, decline invitations to July 4th events. And I think first what I started doing was no longer participating with 4th of July before I really started to celebrate Juneteenth. But there was no teaching of it while I was in school. For my kids now, the only child that I know for certain where they are even having these discussions is my 10-year-old daughter, her 4th grade teacher, which I'm really grateful for. She has had some really good lessons and some really honest conversations regarding the history of Black people, including Juneteenth. And so, yes, there has been some changes. There's not enough. That's one of our list of demands for the town of Manchester, in terms of making American history to include the history of enslaved Africans and Black people in this country, that it needs to become mandatory in the curriculum, and that for all age groups, starting from kindergarten to graduate, to 12th grade. So there's some change, but we have a long way to go.
Absolutely. And just as, from the, maybe in kindergarten, kids are learning about July 4th. I think many kids can echo what July 4th is and why we celebrate it. And the same should be true for Juneteenth. So I'd like to move now to Dr. Tinson. So Dr. Tinson, as you know, President Biden recently declared Juneteenth a national holiday. And so because that happened last week, we had to shift our discussion a little bit. So if you will, would you please, I guess, this is one of the things that advocates and proponents of reparations, I'd like to go to reparations, have been seeking for a very long time. Can you please, Dr. Tinson, discuss the contemporary argument regarding reparations and how it connects to Juneteenth?
Wow. Yes. I mean, I think, well, first I want to, if I can, give a little bio on, how I grew up as well, because I think that that's a context I like to talk about, because I grew up in Los Angeles in a place called Watts, California, South Central, but it's a very southern, in the 70s and 80s, it's a very southern city and part of Los Angeles because of the migrations west. And so my folks were from Mississippi on my dad's side, and my mother's side was from California, but my dad's side was from Mississippi. And they had relatives and church members, that was part of our church, who were from Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas. For the people who were from Texas, Juneteenth was always a big deal, right? So growing up, we would hear, we didn't celebrate it in our house necessarily annually, but when someone at the church would put something on, it was for Juneteenth, and we just kind of knew it as something that we did. It was not in the schools. And I point that out because, Black people in this country have always had to have, two educations, right? Two educational systems. One is the schools, the public schools mostly, and if you can, the private schools, if you can afford that. But most times it was also your church community, your larger community outside of your household, but also outside of your school, certainly. And many educators or educator activist types in the 1960s and 70s actually had Saturday and Sunday schools where they taught African-American history in church basements, in YMCAs and things of that nature, to supplement the absence of African-American history being taught in schools. And this was all over the United States, in places like Detroit, places like Philadelphia, places like New York, New Jersey, and certainly places on the West Coast like Oakland and Los Angeles. So this alternative educational space was always crucial for African Americans. And if we look at the educational history of African Americans, even in the South, there was always this emphasis on education, to the extent that we have to really think about education being central to Black culture in general. And I think that this is important, that we have to understand that education is central to the quest for education, not necessarily degrees and things of that nature, but the quest for education, knowledge about oneself, one's place in the world, is central, has always been central, even under enslavement, to African Americans. I want to point that out first off. Now, this ties directly to the question of reparations, because you can have many different forms of reparations. And at the heart of reparations is, this notion of doing no more harm, or this notion of doing repair, or, actually paying for what you've caused, the pain that you've caused. How do you pay that back? And because slavery and enslavement was an economic enterprise as much as it was about power and race and nation building, reparations has to include an economic agenda. It just has to. I don't know what that looks like. We can get into that. There's been numerous proposals. There's a brilliant new book out called From Here to Equality by Darity that outlines one proposal that's being discussed. But the point is that the way this ties to education, you can really understand that the battle for kind of America's identity is a battle over education, a battle more specifically over history and what we understand to be the central aspects of our country. What are the main pillars? And people like to point to Declaration of Independence, and they like to point to the Constitution, and they like to point to a notion of democracy. But they don't like to deal with the fact that many of those ideas were built on the seeds and the bed, the fertile ground that was laid through Black oppression. And so if you deal with one, you have to deal with the other side of it. So when we think about educational reparations, it has to include a robust and honest understanding of American history that includes all of the negative and the dirt that was done in the advancement of this nation. So I think that those are the pieces that in terms of reparations and education that tie together very nicely. In Juneteenth, what do you do with formerly enslaved folk? That was the fear of the entire South. The entire South at the end of the Civil War is thinking about, and even during the war and leading up to the war, is what do you do with these people? Because they didn't even consider us fully people. And then we have to think about them as citizens with voting rights and gun owning rights and property rights and rights to education. That blew the mind of those folks in that day. And many people in the North also shared those sympathies with the South, and that view of Black people as subhuman or adjacent to some kind of form of humanity that they were trying to practice, which was already deformed. But the point is that you can really do a lot with the centrality of African American history in our public schools. And there have been many tremendous efforts by school districts, by local teachers, by educational advocacy groups to try to really build a more robust understanding of American history that includes Native American history, Asian American history, African American history, Chicano, Mexican American history, and the realities of those things, and the fact that oftentimes those groups were left out of any discussion of equal power, any discussion of equal citizenship, and even if they were granted those rights could be suspended at different moments throughout history. So I think that it's okay for us to be critical citizens and critical students and still appreciate the space. But I don't lay claim to an easy patriotism. If there is going to be some patriotism, it's going to be a critical patriotism, in the sense that many Black people died on these shores as citizens of this country, and therefore we can all share in telling the truth about the country as well. So when we talk about Juneteenth, we have to talk about everything that led up to Juneteenth, and everything that led to the 100 years after, from Juneteenth to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. That's 100 years of Black oppression that was extended. One could argue that that's the afterlife of slavery. So we celebrate Juneteenth, but what was the aftermath? And so reparations should encompass all of that in its understanding. So therefore, it's not an easy project by any stretch of the imagination. It's a complex, layered one, but I think it's one that if we're serious, we should be committed to.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Tinson. And of course, yes, we all learned about the 3/5 compromise. If I remember my math, I'm really going back, I believe we were considered 60% of a person. I believe that's what it's really all about, the 3/5 compromise. And it's so interesting that, in many ways today, we are still considered, as you alluded to, as you said so beautifully, we are still considered subhumans to many people. So I'd like to address Ms. Prescott right now. So, Ms. Prescott, so what do you surmise is the federal government asking Americans to do in regards to Juneteenth? So we've talked about reparations, we've talked about the 3/5 compromise, we've talked about what America needs to do. What do you think the federal government is asking Americans to do in regard to Juneteenth by making this a federal holiday?
Absolutely nothing. This will probably be my last talking engagement, because I am growing very, very tired. As many of you know, I'm going on a frontline sabbatical. Technically, I was starting to July 1st, and then I had to move it up. So I don't believe that our federal government is really asking what they are asking us to do. I'm not going to apologize. Y'all know me. Y'all follow me on Facebook and Instagram, and y'all see me out in these streets. They just want us good little Black folk to stay in our place. So this is what you're going to do here. You're going to take this little holiday right before we sentence George Floyd. You're going to take this to calm down, so that way y'all don't go uprising for a whole nother summer again. That was not for the Americans. Juneteenth was to appease, or try to appease, Black people, and to keep our cools, activists like me, to keep our cools. And if I had to be completely honest, although for Manchester, I had a part to play in getting the town to recognize it as a holiday, I did not really want it to be a national holiday. I mean, white people gonna get off and get paid? Like, it just don't, something about it just doesn't feel right in my soul. Amazon finna make a whole lot of money off of it. Walmart, you know, they're gonna start selling cars and buy two, get one free shirts, you know. Capitalism is going to skyrocket once again off the backs of Black people. So if you're going to celebrate Juneteenth, white folk, you need to buy Black, buy local, buy small. But I wish I had a much more hopeful response. Because you cannot, like Dr. Tinson said, you cannot acknowledge Juneteenth without acknowledging how we got to Juneteenth. And if we're not going to acknowledge how we even got to Juneteenth, then for what? So if we're going to have this be a national holiday, and if we're going to start teaching that to our kids that this is a national holiday, which many kids are out of school by then anyway, then I want to make sure that the conversations are being had to talk about how we even got there. The holiday is nice to a lot of Black people. I was a little upset because I like that we had this thing, like Black people amongst ourselves, for those of us who celebrate, like we had this thing that we knew and we celebrated and we enjoyed. And now we gotta share it. we always gotta share something. We can't never just have our own thing. And so I don't think that our government is asking Americans to do anything except buy more hamburgers and hot dogs and have another barbecue. And you know, for some who didn't see, Target was trying to celebrate Juneteenth for its employees, and they had a table, I think like a kente cloth out, and they had a little thing with watermelon and a thing with red Kool-Aid for those in the
stereotype. Yes.
Yeah, call it Kool-Aid. It was red Kool-Aid. You know, and it was some other things. And so you missed it. Like, you missed it, and you should have just left it alone. If anything you wanted to do, you could have gave your African-American workers a day off paid and let the white people work. But I mean, I'm joking, but I'm not. So I don't really believe they are asking us to do anything except for us to once again wait another 100 years before they give us some other symbol to kind of make us feel as if we are part of history, when we know we're part of it, but they want to somehow try to say, hey, look, see, we got something, so you shouldn't be so angry. So I don't really think they're looking for much, honestly.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Tinson, would you like to add to that, please?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say amen to everything Sister just said. And I think, I mean, the government, it's interesting because if they're not going to put through a mandate to say, hey, this is how you should celebrate Juneteenth, but they just mark it as a calendar holiday. And the citizens now, we could do with it what we please. But I totally wholeheartedly agree with this question of how in the world does a Black holiday equal a day off for white folks, right? This is a kind of ridiculous, part of this that I'm sure Uncle Biden did not see. But my point is that I think, we have to always make these holidays what they should be, right? Like there was a big deal in the late 80s around Dr. King's holiday, right? Like that wasn't a foregone conclusion. Like, white folks now want to say, oh yeah, everybody clap for Dr. King. We all supported Dr. King. But there were states in the South, Arizona comes to mind, Mississippi comes to mind, Louisiana, where they had elected officials actually opposing a federal holiday for King, right? So now it's like, okay, we got King, and so now everybody celebrates King. All the baseball people celebrate Jackie Robinson. Like all that stuff is brand new, right? But they only choose one person at a time. But we just always have to make these holidays real for us. And so, I also should be honest and just say, when we were celebrating Juneteenth, it was a celebration. Like, I don't remember anybody gathering around and saying, hey, we need to, honor our ancestors right now. We might say prayer or something like that, but there was no kind of formality to it. It was like just a celebration for us, but we knew what it meant. It meant just kind of black freedom in a general sense. But I think we have opportunity now, those of us who are inclined to do it, to really make it matter. it's never going to matter to all of the United States, because clearly we have a divided United States, right?
Absolutely.
Which is oxymoron, but it says that it's a divided United States. And I would even argue that it was divided from the very beginning. And so the point is that someone says, well, that's what holds the whole thing together, is these divisions, but it's actually what's holding us back in many regards. And especially on the topics that we're talking about today, which is about racial justice, education equality, economic justice, those kind of concepts are foreign to, and many people take those concepts and are openly resistant to those concepts, right? The idea of equal education, the idea of even livable wages for some people is just anathema. They can't imagine it. The idea that you might say, you know, we need to think about how wealth is distributed in this country is a question that people don't even want to ask, because it starts to sound like socialism. And this is what happened to Bernie, right? I mean, for whatever we think about Bernie, but the problem is that the question of economic justice has to be a part of how we understand and advance society. To the extent that we want to have that conversation, to me, that's how we measure how modern we are. But we're very backward. This country is very backward. So I think in regards to Black folks, they're not trying to really deal with the material discrepancies in our citizenship, right? Which is access to healthcare, the impact of COVID crisis, the impact of the policing crisis, the impact of the prison crisis, the impact of you name it, right? They're not trying to deal with that, but we can mask these things behind a holiday and say, hey, we're one step closer. And I think that the big game that unfortunately the country plays with us is that it upholds inequity in the name of progress. So inequity is part of the political project, and it's baked in. And so it befuddles the imagination to think about this as a totally progressive country. It is not. In many respects, it's backwards. But I think those of us who are of conscience need to figure out ways to do it. And some of those ways are kind of outside of the mainstream. And I think that that's where we've been relegated to for much of this. And so when you have some kind of mainstream attention, yes, you breathe with it, take it as it is, but you know that the work is well far from being done and far from over.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for talking about the inequities. I know that in my school district right now, equity is the buzzword right now, but so is CRT, critical race theory. So let's move to that, if you will. Critical race theory is the buzzword on the lips of conservatives and liberals alike. So would you briefly tell us what critical race theory is? Because I see, like on Facebook and in other forums, people don't even seem to understand what it is. They are talking about it. They don't want it happening in their schools. But I don't think they have a really good understanding of it. So what is critical race theory and how should it be addressed in our schools? And do you see that as a link toward reparations for one in a certain way? Because you also mentioned that you don't know in terms of reparation what that might translate into, but we do know that we need to start by having the truth taught in schools. So let's talk about critical race theory and how it should be addressed in our schools.
Well, you remember the previous president, to Biden, had this, he had his hats made that was called Make America Great Again, right?
Yeah.
And so just to show you how original the Republicans are, that he actually got that from Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, that was Ronald Reagan's thing in the 1980s. Make America Great Again. That was his slogan. So why am I saying that? I'm saying it because the Republicans they're behind schedule on this one, right? And they're trying to figure out a way to gin up some old debates about American culture and to have a false debate about the loss of America's soul and who America really is at its heart. And so CRT is the big boogeyman now that is wresting Americans away, or trying to wrest away from an idyllic notion of America. And again, they're 40 years late, because CRT has been in the academy, at least in law schools, in law classrooms, for 40 years. Most people are just now hearing this, but it's a 4 decades old creation by Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, and many others. And so, in fact, in the 1990s, critical race theory was getting some traction in some law review articles and things of that nature. But the point of CRT is to really show us the ways in which a logic of race gets embedded and encoded by legal and political structures. So it's a theory that helps us to understand how power actually manifests. And this is what scares everyone to the extent that they know about it. But the problem is that they are putting in things that don't belong in CRT in CRT. Mm-hmm. First off, what's lost is that it's a legal theory, right? It's put up by people. One could say they're politically aligned to the left because they're progressive. They want a broad-based, citizenship and everybody have equal access to, defense under the Constitution, protection of their rights under the Constitution. They want that equally distributed, so one could say that that's a progressive idea, but one could say that that's also a liberal idea, right? And one could say that part of conservatism has some liberalism built into it. Okay, fine. But they're asking CRT to do a whole lot of work right now. And really, I don't think we should even take it serious, these news debates, because these people who are out here are really just trying to distract us from actual progress and actual material concerns that have been levied by people who are ostracized and marginalized for many, many, many years. So this is just one extra thing that they're trying to cling to get us to go chase it. And then we'll all see that there was nothing there to begin with. The people who are using this stuff on right-wing websites, they have no idea what it's about. They haven't read Kimberly Crenshaw. They refuse to listen to Kimberly Crenshaw. And so for me, I don't really take them serious. What I do take serious is the way in which it comes into debates in schools and school districts and amongst school boards, because those places are mirrors of our legislative apparatus. And so the way that they govern is much along party line. So the point is that all we need to do is go back a few years, maybe 3 or 4 years, to look at the kind of major debates that was held about the teaching of ethnic studies in places like Phoenix and Tucson, Arizona, where they were gaining traction and teaching in public schools a curriculum that included a robust ethnic studies curriculum as a elective. It was as an elective. It wasn't even supplementing or replacing what they were teaching in the history curriculum or the literature curriculum that focused on, traditional American subjects, et cetera. But ethnic studies, because they were trying to get the local community's history written in the curriculum in a school district that were 80 to 90% Latino or Latinx. So they want their histories inside of the curriculum. And you know what these legislators did? They basically said, if you teach this, I'm collapsing a lot of history here, but if you teach this, then we will begin to take money from your schools. Mm. So immediately the teachers and the principals who had been open to the idea of a newer curriculum that was more reflective of the student body and their histories and their ancestors' histories, they start to say, we can't do that because then we're going to lose money in our school. So that was it. So if you want an example of how this thing plays out and how it's playing out, I was just watching on the news just this week, last week, there was a huge fight in a school district in Virginia at a school board meeting, and it was all white folks there. It wasn't even like a quarter of black parents, that was saying, we want, Martin Luther King on the cover of everybody's, notebook. No, it was white parents there saying, don't dare teach this. And so anybody who had kind of like a liberal mindset that was saying, hey, well, let's figure out what this actually is and how it could be useful, those people were ostracized. It was to the point where people started to fight and had to be taken out in handcuffs in one clip on the news that I saw in Virginia. So this is how, that's what I said, it's a battle over how we understand the country. And the fact is, we prefer, not we, but there's a majority of people who prefer a mythical understanding of American history, and they've tied their personal identity to that. So then when we say we want rights, then they say you're using your identity to, You see, in fact, the curriculum, when we don't have identities in the curriculum, we just have one identity, is American identity, but it has to be a white centric one, you see?
Right.
So the point is that that's why this is just a red herring. I don't think we need to spend much time, but there's a dangerous aspect to the kind of vehement attitude that they have towards CRT, even though they don't understand it. But the reason why CRT is important is because it helps us to understand the way in which power is codified in law. And that is crucial to understanding inequities that we say we're trying to address.
Absolutely. And it's so true that, you know, white identity is always the default. So we see it in our curriculum, we see it in our communities, we see it in everything that we do. Everywhere you go, it's like everything is based around white identity. So let's talk a bit about, we know that the 4th of July, it's for many people, you see the people with the red, white, and blue. And that's not to say that, you know, we don't honor the US flag. Of course, the flag has taken on, from my perspective, a whole new meaning. It's like the American flag has been dirtied. It's been sullied by the far right folks. So let's talk a little bit about the 4th of July, a national, a federal holiday. And I know that for many years, people of color, more and more people of color are not even beginning to celebrate it, because if you really, really know, that's for another discussion, the history behind the 4th of July and what really happened on the 4th of July, you would really understand why many Black folks do not celebrate the 4th of July. So let's talk about freedom then, right? Because again, 4th of July, freedom, not necessarily for many Black people. What does freedom look like, or what should it look like for Black Americans today? And is it possible to achieve freedom? For us to really be free? And that's for either one of you.
Over the last, I want to say, few months, or more than that, but the last few months, I have been working on some programming, free programming, which I'm going to be looking into, like it being like a pilot program for the town of Manchester, for youth and families in what Manchester, Connecticut would consider more of the less affluent areas. But I'm from Philly, so if you have a driveway and trees, you don't live in a hood. But that's just me. So, and so I'm spending less time after my sabbatical focusing on protesting and being in places where I'm putting myself out there to be even spat in the face by white supremacists. I am now focusing on giving the tools to the people. To me, that what Fred Hampton wanted, to me, getting the people what they need. Because if I'm out there protesting, like, you know, we need affordable housing. If I'm at the Capitol, we need affordable housing. And meanwhile, Black people are going homeless, right? So what I need to do is I need to figure out a way to raise money so I can help them pay their rent. So to me, what freedom looks like for us is to understand this is the monster that we're up against. And then slowly learning how, not so much how to slay the monster, but almost to move in such a way that you kind of camouflage so the monster doesn't necessarily see you, if that makes sense. I want to be able for my people, for us to be free. What that looks like to me is giving them financial literacy at an early age. So with one of our programs, we're going to be hiring 10 high school mentors. Well, in order for them to be a mentor, they have to go through financial literacy. They have to understand what direct deposit is. They have to understand all of that. So for me, it's about not so much me advocating for others, but teaching others how to begin to advocate for themselves. If I can show up into a school, and I noticed, which is kind of one of the ways I got started here in Manchester, my daughter was probably at the time one of the best soccer players in the school. And when I look at the team and she tries out, she plays on an elite team with all the girls. But when she goes to the school, and she doesn't make the team, and she plays on the same exact team, on an elite team, and she starts over these girls. Well, if I know I'm sitting there and I'm angry, and there's other Black and brown parents are angry, but I'm the only one that goes up to the Board of Ed to have the meeting, and they're like, no, I can't do that. I am in a place now where freedom is now me teaching them, yes, you see something wrong, you say something, because it looks like I'm the crazy one if I go up there and say this is a problem. You don't have anybody on your side to say this is also a problem. But if I'm going up there and I have my own meeting, and then so-and-so goes up there and so-and-so goes up there, we don't even have to all be in the meeting together. Eventually they're like, okay, listen, we're having way too many of these meetings, it's taking way too much of my time. So to me, I don't truly believe that we need to stop thinking that we're going to get that from our government. When you talked about whiteness is like the thing that that's the thing that we have to compare ourselves to. That's
It's
not
the
even
default. Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's not even just the default here. It's the default everywhere.
Yep.
So for me, I just think that freedom first is recognizing that we have to stop asking for it and looking for it from our oppressor. And then we have to begin to take people like myself to take the time and go into the community and say, from point A to point Z, this is how you do this. This is how you do this. And this is how you do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And I hear your passion. And that's one of the reasons why, Ms. Prescott, I wanted you to be here tonight, because I love your passion and the drive and the zeal that you have. So Dr. Tinson, I want to mention to the audience, we're going to start addressing your questions. So if you can start putting those in the chat. I see that there's one already, but before we do that, I'd like to hear what Dr. Tinson has to say about Black freedom, about what that should look like or would look like for Americans today, Black Americans today.
Yeah, so I think the first thing we could do is fund all of our schools adequately, right? All Black schools where there's predominantly Black children, and this is not to exclude any other children, but in public schools where there's predominantly Black, make sure that they are up to, that they have all the bells and whistles that all the rich schools have, right? But of course, we know how schools are funded, and so we can see that. But so that's why it has to be an overhaul, and that's why it has to just be money and resources reallocated. You can go down the list of things, right? You can go down healthcare, you can go down, we talk about educational access. We could talk about imprisonment, the abolition of prisons, and really rethinking crime in this country, rethinking punishment in this country. That will be some aspect of it. But all these things are just approximations, because you never get back all of the atrocities that you suffered already. You never get that history back. Think about in the 20th century how much land Black farmers lost in this country. That's an underrated topic that we don't even talk about.
Absolutely.
Not just land ownership, but farmers.
Homes also.
Homes, but farmers, their land was taken and eroded, and so for me, we could think about those aspects. When you think about the movement to the way in which, weed has been legalized, cannabis has been legalized, right, in many spaces. And you think about the number of Black men in particular who are doing sentences for weed charges. That is just the absurdity of absurdity. But who's not talking about freeing those Black people? The white men who are in the weed industry, right? So where you could turn any direction and point to an example. But I think, I don't want to be too dark here, but I think, we're living in the afterlife of slavery and an extended form of captivity. Now, you say, okay, you're a professor, that sounds real academic. But what I mean by that is that even as society so-called progresses, Black people are still left behind, right? And so there's always a playing catch up at every interval of progress. So when you talk about wages going up, where are wages for Black people? When you talk about Homelessness, Black people, still suffering the brunt of homelessness and being part of the unhoused population. So the point is, it's just anywhere you look, you can, if you improve Black life over generations, not just one individual family, not just one individual case that we won, not just one individual settlement that you can't even talk about, right? Because once you settle, it's like, say if there's a wrongful death suit and there's a settlement, you have to sign an NDA in order to get the money, and so people can't even tell what they got, from their family member being lost if there is a settlement. And many times there's not even a settlement. But my point is just to say, if you improve over generations the opportunity to accumulate wealth, we could talk about student loan debt and the way in which student loan debt for African Americans is triple that of any other population, except probably the Latinx population, right? Now you could point to different aspects of society and say, what is Black life in this particular category? And if you can figure out a way to structurally improve that over generations, then that will mean that that's a form of freedom, even though freedom is itself an abstract idea, right? So the point is just, how do we improve materially the life chances? And I'll just give you one example. Where I live in St. Louis, there was a study that talked about your zip code determined your life expectancy.
Absolutely.
And in the predominantly Black areas, the life expectancy for people like me, male, mid 40s, I'm supposed to get up, if I live in a predominantly Black area, I'm supposed to get up no further than about 55 years old. In the so-called predominantly white area, more affluent, wealth, concentration, etc., 91 years old is the life expectancy. So that's a 4-decade gap in my life expectancy versus somebody my same age who just lives 10 minutes away in a particular direction. And we can understand that as a part of all American cities. So this study that was done here could be done elsewhere. And we can look at Hartford, right? And Bristol, Connecticut, and Springfield, Massachusetts, and Holyoke, Massachusetts, and look at that versus Amherst life expectancy, Springfield versus Amherst, right? And so this is why it's important to really understand structures. It's not just people's individual choices. These are things that people don't control by and large, right? Like which opportunities are available for healthcare, where you can go get healthcare, where you can get dental care, where you can have a livable wage, where you can have savings, where you can have investments and benefits and time off, not work yourself into the ground, not work in dangerous environments. Some of that stuff is outside of our control. See, so this is why we have to get back to looking at structures and institutions over just, some morality argument about who's doing what. And so for me, those
absolutely
mean some kind of freedom, but freedom is an abstract idea. But I think, liberation is something that I seek, and that's maybe that's another concept that we could think about.
Tinson or, oh, there you go.
We go
sorry, I lost you for Dr. Tinson, I don't know if it was just on my end, but I'd lost you for a little bit, but absolutely. So there are thousands and thousands of cases to confirm that much has to be done just for us to be able to catch up to where many white folks are. And I don't even know if it's possible, though many of us are doing well. There are so many more of us who are not doing well, and it's all because of institutional racism. It's all because of all of it starting with slavery and through Reconstruction and even up to today. We're still in our schools today. Education is not even equal. So Dr. Tinson, and there's a question in the chat. I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but maybe one of you might speak to this. It says here, as a teacher, I believe there's nothing good when the federal government gets involved in teaching theories. So I don't know if,
I mean, I mean, that's quick. I think the problem is the American government is already in your school. It's already there, right? It's already taught you a theory of America. It's already taught American exceptionalism. And so the point is it's already taught manifest destiny. It's already taught, the age, what we call the age of imperialism. What does that actually mean? It's already taught those things. So for me, the reason why it's not so much looking at the federal government. And I understand this argument of like, yeah, we need less government. Okay, fine. There might be a part of me that wants full self-governance, absolutely. And I believe that in different time periods we could approach that more effectively. I don't think the self-government right now will be, the model for this American public, because we crazy and we got too many guns. Okay, so I just feel that I understand the argument, but at the same time you do need some regulatory situation. The point is, can Black people be a part of the regulatory stuff? And I think that's the thing that we miss, is that Black people aren't part of the regulatory apparatus by and large. Now we have become part of that, and so I think that's the space. But no, you have to have the Department of Education say that these subjects can be taught in schools, and that we can begin to test for these subjects. And the reason why you have to test for these subjects is because that is what makes the knowledge and information worthy of knowing. When you're testing for something, you're saying, this is the essential knowledge. Whatever school district you're in, whatever subject it is, when you're testing something, whether it's the, SAT, ACT, whatever it is, when you're testing, you're saying, this is the knowledge that you need to know to go into this section of society. And I'm saying that I believe the experiences of African Americans, African descendants in this country needs to be more centralized to our understanding of American history. And then we test on that. We expect people to know Frederick Douglass's 1852 speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." We expect people to know who Du Bois is. We expect people to know who Anna Julie Cooper is. And we test on those things. The way you become a modern society is you determine what's the essential knowledge that people need. And as long as you relegate the things that we're talking about to some marginal, angry community, and you're saying that it's not worth knowing. And it's in that space that it's not worth knowing that we're trying to disrupt, because we're considering this essential, because our lives are essential. To the degree that you want a progressive society, then you have to appreciate that point. And the only way it could get into all of our school districts is to have the Department of Education kind of sanction this stuff. And then from there, you have to think about how it actually gets taught and all those kinds of things. But yeah, it's not so much as saying, the federal government, in your classroom. But guess what? I grew up reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, in my public school. So whose idea was that? It certainly wasn't my Black neighborhood's idea that we did that, but we did that. Okay, so the point is the government's already in the schools. And so we need to think about being more creative about who's representing the government and what we're talking about when we're talking about representative government in schools. And I think, we have a long way to go with that. But I think we need to disrupt American exceptionalism. And so the degree that we're doing that work, I think we're making some progress. And there are efforts of school districts around the country, in places in California, in the Bay Area, where they're already starting to do an ethnic studies curriculum in their high schools, and so we'll see if that survives any injunctions that might come down. But, it's a battle for how we understand America.
Mm-hmm.
And I could just add on to that real quick. Saying that liberty and justice for all is technically a theory. It's not, so the government is already introducing theories into our kids' minds. So, because that ain't a fact.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And saying it doesn't translate into action, right? Because we say it, and you know what, this reminds me of, someone posted on Facebook that, so they want children to say the Pledge of Allegiance in schools, right? And pledge allegiance to the flag. But when people like us stand up, right, and advocate for those rights and advocate for the rights of people of color, children of color in schools and communities, then it becomes a problem. So are we really saying liberty and justice for all? So you have a point there. It seems like it's more theory rather than practice, right? So there's a statement here. I'm just going to read it, and then I'm going to have each of you decide how you'd like to respond to that. But it has to do with marijuana. So in the chat, someone writes, is the issue of freeing those incarcerated for marijuana-related issues going to be handled state by state? If so, how is Connecticut going to approach these individuals' needs for a new, fresh start? How is Massachusetts going to approach this? And so maybe you guys can think about how should these, not just Connecticut and Massachusetts, but how should these issues be approached? Of course, we talk about the fact that there are millions of Black men who are imprisoned for small amounts of marijuana. Not that I wish that we would do away with marijuana, but the thing is, we have Black people who are incarcerated for marijuana, and now you have white people today who are making millions doing quite the same thing. So what are your thoughts on that? And if you'd like to start. Correct.
First things first is you for Connecticut, you need to free them. I don't like, I agree. Yeah, I'm an abolitionist as well anyway, but you need to free them. And then what you need to do is there needs to be, because the government enslaved them for that, they need to have a grant program specifically designed for marginalized people who were enslaved for selling marijuana. So that way they can have a grant to open up a dispensary to be able to do that. Because one of the issues, not even just with marijuana, but even with CBD, one of the big issues here in Connecticut, I know of, there's an activist who has been fighting for years to get CBD and marijuana legalized here. One of the biggest issues, she's a Black woman, is that even the people, the Black and brown people who are free and trying to break into that market, they're shut out. They don't have they're not able to get the licensing and the permitting and the funding. So even after you free them, that's not enough. Then you need to have them a fast track. And when I say fast track, a fast track to licensing and permitting and all of those things, along with some money. And you don't get to determine, because that's the other thing that white supremacy likes to do. They like to say, we're going to give you this money, but we're going to put stipulations on it. No, it needs to be completely free. So, that to me is just what needs to happen. And it needs to happen like now.
And so this is what we mean when you say so well, that it's not about the day off. It's not about giving people, everyone, the day off on Juneteenth, right? These are the things that need to be done to address the issues that continue to plague people of color, African Americans, and other people of color in this country. So, Dr. Tinson, would you? Oh, go ahead, honey.
Add one thing.
Yes.
As a Black woman who grew up between Jersey and Philly, you see drug dealers all the time. And so I come up in era, I'm almost 40, July 25th, 40. I come up in a time where drug dealers, and still they they were painted as these, and for selling, let's just focus on weed. They were painted as these hardcore criminals that you could not date, that you could not socialize with, that you could not, you couldn't go to school. If you went to school with them, you stayed far away from them. You couldn't bring them over to your house. We even have so many things have come up about with Black men selling weed, selling marijuana. Families have been broken up. Children have been told that their fathers are nothing. So I don't think that white America, white supremacy, a lot of things they think is just simple. I don't think they understand just how deep the trauma goes. And so for me, this for me, it is white people smoking weed anyway. Even when it was legal, they were smoking and it was okay. But when Black people are doing it, we're demonized. And so they need to be free. Like they just need to be free now.
Absolutely. Dr. Tinson?
No, I agree wholeheartedly with all of that, you know, and I just think, and just to add to that, there's that internalized stigma, you know, based on the way in which we've been treated in this society, to where something that's even legal now, people still have a stigma associated with it. So it's kind of like, hey, stay away from that. But you're absolutely right in terms of the political economy of it. You know, some of these licenses, you had to have $500,000 to even start something. And so I knew a lot of people who, not personally, but I knew of people who were trying to corral partnerships of, you know, small business guys who were trying to go for these loans individually so that they could, you know, put all the money together and then apply for one of these licenses in the state of Massachusetts and elsewhere. So so that's an access issue, right? Because who can walk into the bank and ask for $250,000? You know what I'm saying? Like, what does that look like? And who does that look like in our society? So that's a structural piece right there, right? So even if you wanted to get into that business, you're locked out, as Karen was just saying. So, but that's just one example of things. I have seen some progress being made by some professional athletes, and of course, the professional athletes, you know, they've earned, you know, a lot of money, and so some of them are actually going into the dispensary business. You know, I'm thinking about Paul Pierce. I could say all this stuff because it's on Instagram. You know, Paul Pierce, Matt Barnes, Al Harrington. These are all former NBA players who've really gone and studied how to get into the business, the dispensary business, and they've opened up shop. And so I think that there's some stuff there that where we can point to and say, hey, at least some affluent Black men are able to do it. But those three people in particular are also supporting what Corinne was just saying in terms of changing laws that incarcerated folk for this, right? So they're about both getting into the business side, but also the decriminalization side, which is important. So.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So let's go. What do you say, and this is for both of you, to those people who continue to say, we should just move on and let bygones be bygones? Is that so? Is that what we should do? And that's for both of you.
January 6th, if that was the case, you know, let it go. Yeah, why couldn't they let it go? He lost. Okay. January 6th, if we want.
Would you like to call the name of the he?
No, he not. January 6th, a white woman told me Black lives don't matter and spat in my face. So let bygones be bygones. All because I was trying to get racism declared a public health crisis here in the state, which we did succeed. So pat myself on the back for that. Yeah. But I personally, and which is why I'm in therapist with a Black woman, and I advocate that any Black people on here, whether you think you need it or not, get you some therapy with a Black person, a Black provider. I personally am having a hard time letting bygones be bygones because my grandfather's family in Barbados, some colonizers came to them and said, go to Panama, build this canal, you'll have a great life. They did the same to my grandmother's family in Jamaica. They came there, my great-grandparents died because the conditions were horrible and they didn't have a great life. And so my grandmother and grandfather met, and, you know, next thing you know, my dad is born and they don't have the great life there. And so they come to America and they settle in Philadelphia. When they got here, they came at a time when they realized not only was being Black a crime, but to be Black and to speak another language and to have an accent was an additional crime. And so I have absolutely no connection to my Panamanian roots, to my Jamaican roots, to my Bayesian roots, because my grandparents told my father and his brother and sister, do not speak Patois, do not speak Spanish. We are not eating the native food. We are no longer making curry or jerk or arroz con pollo. We are making, baked and fried chicken, green peas, and mashed potatoes. And so I have been stripped of that rich culture. My grandfather hung himself in the basement of their home because he had the idea that if he came to America and if he pulled himself up by his bootstraps, that somehow he would be able to provide a better life for his family. And when he got here, he realized it didn't matter if he made the boots, if he made the straps, and he laced them up and pulled them up, simply because he was a Black man, he was never going to achieve the American dream. So for me, to say let bygones be bygones is a slap in the face. I have absolutely no understanding of what it's like to really be first generation born in America and to graduate with a degree and to try to be an entrepreneur. Like, I understand the importance of it, but at the same time, I have no way of going back to anywhere and saying, look what I was able to do. You guys came so long, and look, because we have no connection to those families, to that family, to the land, to the language, to the food, to the culture, to the music. So for me, I may be bitter, and I feel like I have every right to be bitter, but I can't just let bygones be bygones. The trauma and the pain, the things that we have to do as Black people just to simply wake up and just be is exhausting. It is frustrating. It is tiring. As a 39-year-old Black woman, I sit back sometimes when I go out to eat or if I'm in the grocery store and I look at the jubilee of white people. And as a 39-year-old strong, proud, Panamanian, Bayesian, Jamaican, American Black woman, I look at white women sometimes wish I was white. Because there is a peace and there is a freedom and there is a joy that they possess that I will never know anything about living in this world as a Black woman, as a Black vocal, natural hair, big nose, big lip woman. And so we're not past anything. We just celebrated 100 years of Tulsa. People who remember that were able to testify. We haven't gotten anywhere to be able to say, let bygones be bygones. America hasn't atoned for what it has done to the indigenous people here. We pay rent to live in this house. I pay rent to live in this house, which is on stolen land. Make that make sense.
Absolutely.
I can't just let bygones be bygones. And any person, any white person who says that is the epitome of privilege.
Thank you so much for that impassioned response, Dr. Tinson.
Yeah, I mean, I think Americans like to be selective about what they remember. And they like to be very selective, and they like to remember the things that make them feel good about the country. And even when those things have done horrible atrocities, they still would like to remember them fondly. And so, for example, we just went through last couple of summers efforts to remove Confederate statues from around different parts of the country. But those Confederate statues were put up in the early 20th century to commemorate the Confederacy. The Confederacy, the last that I checked, was disloyal traitors to victory. I thought that we read that in history. So I thought, why do we need to have Confederate monuments? But see, they prefer to remember those things without remembering what they represented. And what they represented was the continuation of slavery. What they were trying to do was expand slavery way into the West as far as they could go. And so because they were prevented, then we now need to valorize those people who wanted to do that. Well, That's why we can't let bygones be bygones. You lost the war. We should just move on. You should be part of the American public. But now you're saying, no, we want to cling to this particular thing, to the point where not too long ago, and you could probably see this throughout New England, there will occasionally be caravans of motorcycles who roll through 100 deep with Confederate flags, right? And so this is modern day. So what are we saying we should forget, right? So they're saying we should let go of the oppression, and they're holding on to the very symbols of the oppression. So how does this make sense? And this is the kind of mind game that the mainstream likes to play with us, but we know better. So the point is that we're going to continue to talk about history, the dark aspects of history, enliven our family stories, as the sister just shared, and talk about how this history is way more complicated than we were taught it, and it's way more complicated than most Americans want to even admit. And so, so because it's complicated, because it's long and it's ugly, the fact that we had to deal with lynchings, and the fact that Black people were chased out of communities, right? The fact that Black soldiers returning home from war, World War I, were hung, sometimes in their uniforms, because they weren't seen as Americans like a white American who didn't even serve in the war. So the point is that we have to understand these things and embrace the totality of it, not just the selective pieces that make white Americans feel good. That's the piece that we need to disrupt. And so I think that that's the work that we hope that Juneteenth reminds us of.
Absolutely. And, you know, I would like to add that, you know, as an educator myself, I think about, and as someone who has one of my degrees is in English, my certifications, and I think about all of the books that they call good literature, right? And all of these books are about the white man's struggle. What happens, and I even have friends of European descent who would be quick to say, well, you know, my father came here from Italy, or my father came here from such and such, and they worked hard. But the truth is, when Europeans came to this country, yes, some of them faced a degree of heartache, right? Nothing compared to what our ancestors, when I think about Miss Prescott and the pain that she feels for her grandparents and her parents and so forth. And Europeans actually learned that they can unite, right, against Black people, because many of those same people who were lynching people were actually people who came here from Europe, knowing the way they were treated in their countries, but they came here and realized, you know, I guess it's all about, if you can make someone feel that they are beneath you, I don't know, you can get a rise from that. And I think that's what it's been about. It's about uniting, even when we think about the way people are addressed in this country. If you're white, you're just white. They don't call you African Americans. They don't call you Jamaican Americans. They don't say Italian Americans. They don't say Irish Americans. They just call them white, right? Because it was easier for them to assimilate, and then again to unite, and to treat us and treat us as if we are and are second-class citizens. So I just kind of think about that, and I just wanted to add to what Ms. Prescott said about what her people have had to deal with, what my people have had to deal with. You can't speak a certain way. You can't show your true colors. You have to give up your identity to the extent that you can in order to assimilate into American culture. And again, white being the default. So I just want to ask both of you, we have quite a few allies in our audience today. And these are the people who are alongside us, fighting with us for the rights of people of color. So what can you say to those people? What are some action steps that they should take as they move forward in their advocacy work? And this is for both of you.
I mean, I guess I can start. I mean, I think, you know, reading everything you can is the first step I want to suggest. In terms of action, I mean, you have to move with with information. So you have to know what you're trying to do. Otherwise, you can do more harm. I think you can really should listen to what's coming from Black community spaces. What are they calling for, and then support that, right? Rather than come with your own agenda and saying this is what Black people need. It's like, how do you really do a deep dive and a consistent dive, persistent with what the community desires are. Once you know those things, then you support that. But I think that's where I would start if I was, a so-called ally. But I think, allies, to me, that's a slippery term. And to me, I'd rather people be comrades. I'd rather think in terms of a more bound together future. I'd rather, when they think of their future, that they imagine my future as well. And I think that when we think in those kind of inseparable terms, then we're really ready to do the work to preserve each other. I don't think we're there, but I think, that's an organizing mentality that's based and rooted in history, it's rooted in shared experience. And even when it's not shared experience, it's rooted in a deep commitment to solidarity. And in that space where we're imagining our future is bound up, then I think you can get somewhere in terms of what we're calling allyship. But
Wow.
Until then, I feel like ally can check in and check out. Ally can be here for Black Lives Matter rally, but then not support advancing education for Black marginalized folk, right? Or be at the Black Lives Matter rally and then turn around and say, well, I don't want my kid to go to the bad school. Well, what's the bad school? The bad school is the bad school where it's mostly Black kids. And so we have that kind of bifurcation in thinking sometimes. I think people want to do well when they call themselves allies, but I think it has to be consistent. And I would dare say it has to be a commitment that, for the rest of your life. And to really understand these things deeply and to really be in support long term.
Thank you. Actually, we're down to the last 5 minutes. So, Ms. Prescott, I'm going to ask you to, and this is for both of you, to offer any final thoughts or reflections that you might like to share or reiterate.
I would say yes to do away with the term ally. I like comrades. I never thought of that. I like co-conspirator. I also think that co-conspirators need to educate themselves more on micro reparations. I think that for those here in Connecticut that have met Giselle or met myself, if we are your first Black friends or Black people that you have broken bread with, you need to check yourself on that and ask yourself why. It is very easy for white people to go their entire lives and not have one single Black person over their house or to hang out with or befriend, but it's virtually impossible for Black people to do that. So my final thoughts would be to don't call on Giselle or I when a local Black person is in trouble and say to us, what do I do? You need to now figure out how to use your white privilege so you can be on the front line and advocate and demand justice and fight for Black lives. Don't call on us. Don't let us be the first people you call when there needs to be something that needs to be done. And lastly, I would say that you need to challenge your family. You need to challenge your colleagues. You need to challenge your church. And if many of your colleagues had no problem putting a pride flag and had no problem celebrating in the month of Pride, but do not want to hang a Black Lives Matter flag, you need to question whether or not they should be your friend.
Absolutely. Dr. Tinson?
Yeah.
Any final thoughts?
I think, just figure out a deeper commitment, to justice in a broad sense. Don't be afraid of abolition. We're still in a space of a abolitionist movement, right? We understand abolition of the 1830s and 1850s, but there's a consistent abolitionist movement now around imprisonment, around policing, and things of that nature. So embrace those ideas and embrace the challenge to think differently about the society that we inhabit. And I think that I can't promise that it will be easy, and I don't think it should be easy. And I think part of the commitment is to embrace the hard work that lays ahead. So that's what I would ask that we think about as we depart.
Okay, Dr. Tinson, Ms. Prescott, thank you both for your time. And thanks to those of you in our audience who took time to learn not only about Juneteenth, but about what you can do to make our schools, our communities, our state, our country more equitable places for all people, and for engaging in the uncomfortable work of listening as we seek to heal and move forward as one America united against racism, bigotry, and of course, institutional racism. So please be well and see you all next time. Thank you. Dr. Tinson, if you might stay on, you and Ms. Prescott, please.